again, and welcome. It's lovely to see you all here. For those of you who I haven't met before, and there's certainly a few faces in the crowd that I recognize and a few that I don't, my name is Nick Wright. I'm the Ballycastle Museum Project Officer. So my job is to work on behalf of the council towards getting our lottery-funded grant for Ballycastle Museum up and running. So you may have heard that we currently have a grant to develop the museum, to restore the building that's there, to extend it and to completely refit it. And so that's supported by funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. But this evening, I'm honoured to introduce our speaker, Jonathan Gray, and the topic here, the Boyds of Ballycastle and beyond. What started 4 years ago as an innocent investigation into Adrian Boyd's family, Adrian's with us here this evening as well, took Adrian and Jonathan on a remarkable journey that has spanned 700 years of local and international history, unearthing documentary sources from La Rochelle in France to the island of St. Kitts in the Caribbean, from South Carolina in the USA to Ballycastle, County Antrim, and Waterford in Ireland, West Kilbride in Scotland. Now, having amassed an archive of over 6,000 images and documents, they feel that it's time to pass their research on to others, revealing the remarkable story of an Ayrshire family who have left their mark on history. Of course, for anyone interested in Ballycastle's history, the name Boyd is synonymous with the town. Having inherited the stewardship of the area from his maternal family in 1711, Colonel Hugh Boyd transformed the estate, bringing together the three different communities of Strownchesc, Port British, and the market town, and forging Ballycastle into an important industrial centre over the course of a single generation. Hugh Boyd's descendants retained their local prominence until the death of Kathleen Isabel Boyd in 1944. However, for all of Boyd's importance, relatively few of the 3,000 objects in Ballycastle Museum's collection relate directly to Hugh Boyd or his descendants. The slideshow that's been running here as you came in this evening illustrates the key Boyd objects that we've got in the collection, and we'll be using these to help tell that Boyd story once the new museum is opened. This relative lack of objects highlights the importance of researchers like Jonathan and like Adrian, and the work that they've done pulling together the story of the Boyds of Ballycastle and contextualizing it within a world context. So I hope you'll join with me then in welcoming Jonathan to present his talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Firstly, can I just say the reason why I'm sitting here tonight is I've done that much walking today that my knees have packed up altogether. So forgive me for sitting and not standing doing this presentation. Firstly, I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight, first and foremost. Adrian and I have lived in a somewhat cloistered world for the last 4 years as we've undertaken this Boyd research, and it's wonderful we now get to share our discoveries with you. Can I pay a special word of thanks to Ramone Parish for providing this great venue and in such a poignant location adjacent to Trinity Church. And last but not least to Dr. Nick Wright and Causeway Coast and Glens Borough Council for facilitating tonight's talk. So before I begin the talk, I'd just like to quote these words for you from the great Scottish historian Cosmo Innes. In the early history of all countries, but especially of one whose history has been obscured not so much even by the loss of its national records as by the folly of writers attempting to supply that loss by fabulous inventions, it is of the first consequence to assemble as a foundation all historical facts, however trivial. And the collector will often be astonished to find these, singly so unimportant, when placed together, arranging themselves in the lucid order and full detail of true history. So that was in the beautiful language of academic Scotland in the 1820s. If we bring that up to the modern vernacular, I would say, in essence, sources and detail, no matter how seemingly trivial, over story, are the essence of good historical research. And I hope from what you will see here tonight that that has kind of been as best as possible our watchwords. Although at times you are stretched. But anyhow. So now, by way of an explanation, I think I need to tell you how two men from County Tyrone in Northern Ireland end up in Ballycastle talking about a local historical family. Basically, it's his fault. It began with a seemingly innocent investigation into Adrian's ancestors in County Tyrone, who incidentally come from the townland of Turnabarson back to the late 18th century, at least. Along the way, I made a trip to a local parish church in the village of New Mills, County Tyrone, where I made an interesting discovery. Tullinniskin Church has many old graves, particularly from the 18th century, but this one was, although relatively small, carved in the most extraordinary way and with an ornately detailed coat of arms, which some of you might recognise from locally. The grave was of William Boyd and Margaret Brown, but who were they? To date, Adrian and I have not been able to link them to his ancestral line, so failure number one. But the discovery would lead us on a remarkable journey. The first thing we noticed was that the coat of arms on the Tullinniskin grave was found in a number of other locations, with a particular focus on North Antrim. The old Ramone graveyard in particular had quite a number of surviving examples, and it was not long before we found the link to the prominent Boyd family of Ballycastle. So if any of you have been to Old Ramone, you might have seen some of these. And of course, top right is from Trinity Church itself, I think. In 1862, an entry was made in Burke's Landed Gentry regarding the Boyds of Ballycastle, County Antrim. It stated that the family's lineage was derived from Thomas Boyd of Carncogie. The peak of the Ballycastle Boyd family was during the life of Colonel Hugh Boyd, 1690 to 1765. He was responsible for much of the town's development during that period, with salt and glass works as well as collieries and the building of a major harbour. And he even received substantial government grants towards these enterprises. Now, aware of the history recorded by Burke, and by the way, according to Burke's peerage, that is the only entry that was ever recorded in the entire history of the organisation for the Boyds of Ballycastle, just that one edition. There was no future ones specifically about Boyd of Ballycastle. But then none of them in themselves as a family became titled. That was a later edition and it wasn't specifically their line. So we call this really the story of John and Jane. It's not the story of John and Yoko, for those of you who would remember that. But anyway, it's a bit of a play on the idea. So aware now of the history recorded by Burke, Adrian and I began to explore its origins and perhaps identify links to County Tyrone along the way. Beginning with a reference to a Thomas Boyd of Carncogie, we immediately ran into a problem which we have dubbed the story of John and Jane. This is a clip from an article by Reverend George Hill, serialised in the Coleraine Chronicle in 1864-65. It refers to a John Boyd of Carncogie and a grave to his wife, Jane Peoples, in Old Derrykeegan Graveyard, who died in 1615. He further states John was a former provost of Irvine, but there is no mention of the Thomas Boyd recorded by Burke 3 years earlier. And it's quite interesting to note that Burke comes first, mentions Thomas Boyd, and then this comes 3 years later, and no mention. Some years later, Hill restates his earlier notes about John and Jane, but further stating John was no doubt father of Thomas Boyd. So Thomas is starting to creep into Burke's histories. And then he goes on to say, and the late Dr. Boyd, MP for Coleraine, represented this branch of the Boyds of the route. So we're starting to get a little bit more information, but there's conflicting information really. So that left us with 3 areas of further study arising from Hill's writings. The oldest tombstone of which the writer has any knowledge, marking the grave of a Scottish settler in the route, was raised by John Boyd in 1615 to the memory of his wife, Jane Peebles, in Derrykeegan. This man, previous to his coming to Ireland, had been several years Provost of Irvine. And thirdly, John Boyd settled at Carncogey near Derby. Our efforts to find a John Boyd in the early 1600s drew a complete blank. But there was evidence for a Thomas Boyd. In the early days of the Ulster plantation, it was required that non-English participants should obtain denisation to make them naturalised English citizens before they could hold land in their own right. Whilst there were notable exceptions, a fairly extensive record of those who received denisation was recorded in the calendar of close and patent rolls of James I of England. On the 29th of January 1611, we find one Thomas Boyd listed alongside others as grantees of denisation. It is generally believed that this was Thomas Boyd of Carncogey. So 1611, we see Thomas Boyd of Carncogey receiving sort of nominal English citizenship. That would allow him to own land outright. The earlier reference to Thomas Boyd purchasing land in Carncogey in 1614 was confirmed by examination of the Inquisition of Ulster, published by Hardyman in 1829. On the 24th of February 1614-15, old and new calendars, Thomas Boyd leased 60 acres for himself and his heirs forever. However, the entry also records that Thomas Boyd died on the 15th of August 1634, and the lease passed to his son and heir, Hugh Boyd, who was of full age but unmarried at the time. Given the information on the death of Thomas Boyd of Carncogey, we surmise that he was likely living in Carncogey at the time and set about research on surveys of local churches and cemeteries. We were delighted to discover that a number of sources had recorded the very early grave of a Catherine Peebles, wife to a Thomas Boyd, in Old Derrykeegan parish churchyard, who died in 1615 and was recorded in the late 19th century. This was further confirmed in an excellent book on the churchyard by Dorothy Arthur in 2012. And Kate's with us tonight, who was one of the fellow sufferers with Dara that tramped around that graveyard and exhausted for I don't know how many days, but a brilliant body of work. Fabulous, thoroughly recommended. Sadly, the gravestone, or more probably wall tablet, had been damaged prior to the 1890s. In fact, probably the 1820s is when it happened. Indeed, local history of the old church mentions an explosion and possible attempt to damage the church beyond repair in the 1820s, which may have been cause of the damage to the tablet. It is possible this led to the stone being removed from its likely original location in the church to its current location outside the east gable end. Again, the damage hid the exact name of where Thomas Boyd was from locally, except that it began with a C. It's a fairly good clue. Damage also hid the exact spelling of Catherine's maiden name. Most believe it to have been Peebles. Perhaps the most interesting fact, however, was the mention that Thomas Boyd was former Provost of Irvine. So suddenly things are starting to add up. The grave was included in a work by Reverend Hugh McNeill, 1834 to 1893, a contemporary of Reverend George Hill, and also curate and rector of Derrykeegan Parish, 1867 to 93. His work, The Annals of the Parish of Derrykeegan from AD 453 to 1890, was published posthumously in 1910. And curiously, on page 76, after detailing the transcript of that very same grave of Catherine Peebles, he states, rather interestingly, the Reverend George Hill says the deceased was Catherine Peebles, wife of Thomas Boyd of Carncogey, and that this is the oldest monument to any of the Scottish settlers in County Antrim. But you and I know from what I've just presented to you, that's not actually what Reverend George Hill said on paper. I suspect there were conversations between the two. They were contemporaries, although the older man, Hill, actually outlived the younger man by about 10 years. So I'm quite happy to believe that it had always been intended it was Thomas and Catherine. Even Hill knew that. It probably carried in conversations, but for whatever reason, printing typos or just things lost in translation. The original one was just a red herring. Now this is the excerpt from Dorothy's book on Derry Keek and Old Graveyard. So just nicely here, it summarises most of the things that we now know about it. Dorothy's included a lot of associated facts and obviously a transcription of the grave. And you can see just from that picture there how sharp, in fact, the surviving element of the stone above ground is. And I can make that a wee bit clearer for you. That was a picture taken by Dr. William Rolston back in 2006. And if I can just walk you through this, here lieth, and then it'll be Catherine Peebles. And if we come round to it goes round the circumference of the stone, it'll be down here and up and round again, is the word Provost of Irvine. So it's as clear if you go to that graveyard now to read that lettering as it has been since 1615. It's quite remarkable. The lovely wee thing is the mistake. Do you see here? It's meant to be either the 1st or the 11th of November. The sculptor realised he hadn't actually put the date in. And because it's raised lettering, he has managed to just literally squeeze it in the ear. Either that or added something. So it just shows you they were perfectly capable of making mistakes even back then. So, Thomas Boyd is the Provost of Irvine that we're looking for. So armed with this new information, our sights turn towards Scotland and Thomas Boyd. Before examining Thomas's involvement in the life of Irvine, a wonderful discovery was made amongst the indexed scenes of Ayr. Scenes are a Scottish version of land recording, and they're still in use today, but they have been in use in Scotland since the Middle Ages. And remarkably accurate, usable records are available back to 1590s, and certainly in Ayrshire. So confirmation, it would seem, that Thomas Boyd, then a burgess of Irvine, was married to a Catherine Peebles. And this document is dated to 1603, 27th of November. And it also concerns a Margaret Peebles. In 1896, the then town clerk of Irvine, James Dickey, recorded what he could find by way of a list of the provosts of Irvine from around 1539 onwards. The list was published in John Strawhorn's excellent book in 1986 on the history of Irvine. We can clearly see a Thomas Boyd recorded as provost from 1608 to 1610. Interestingly, he's the only Boyd on the list, the only one. Furthermore, it may be worth noting that his tenure was the only seeming interruption to the career of Archibald George as provost, which spanned nearly 15 years. I have no reason why that interruption occurred in Archibald George's tenure. I might never know. Further examination amongst the monuments of Irvine and Sessenes appears to suggest that Thomas Boyd's career as provost of Irvine ran from at least 1606. This is an extract from a Sessene of 1606. It's clearly witnessed by Thomas Boyd, provost, and this is actually an excerpt of the entry in the Sessene deed itself. Unfortunately, records are limited for this period to allow us to be more exact. The monuments of Irvine, there's a kind of a gap in there between sort of 1602 up to about 1608. I suspect he was probably provost from 1604 to 1610, so 6 years, not 2. A search for other source material on Thomas took us to the archives of the Hunter family of Hunterston, and I'm grateful for Angus Cochrane Patrick in kindly photographing a deed in the Hunterston papers dating to the 1st of February 1609, which was witnessed by Thomas Boyd, Provost of Irvine, and an Archibald Boyd in Underhill. Interestingly, Thomas's association with Hunterston was also found in an incident recorded in Dobby's book on Ponce Cunningham, in which he is rebuked by the captain of Dunbarton Castle along with Robert Hunter of Hunterston for removing hawks from the island of Cumbrae, which lies just off the shore of Ayrshire. on the 2nd of February 1609. What's remarkable about that is they did that day, the day after Thomas and this other man, Archibald, signed this deed. So obviously he was staying there for a while. And I presume Robert said, look, I'm going to do this. Do you want to come with me? Before leaving this connection to the hunters of Hunterston, it is perhaps worth mentioning that in a charter of Arneil Hunter of 12th of March 1615, Margaret Peebles is then wife of Robert Hunter of Hunterston, and from the text likely daughter of the late Patrick Peebles, Burgess of Irvine, and Marriott Montgomery of Hesselhead, and therefore, ergo, Margaret is sister to Catherine Peebles, wife of Thomas Boyd, who died in County Antrim 2 years later. As we know, Thomas Boyd's wife Catherine died in November 1615, and he likely had young children in need of a mother. An entry in the protocol book of Robert Brown, a notary of Irvine, dated the 3rd of August 1616, gives us some further information in the form of a suggested marriage contract between him and Elizabeth Smeaton, widow of Alexander Campbell, former minister of Stevenston. It involved gifting Elizabeth one of his properties in Irvine. We can clearly see it states, sometime provost of Irvine, but now dwelling in the kingdom of Ireland. Elizabeth would later die in 1621. The most common form of death for a woman in this time period was childbirth. It was horrendous. And as a result, any man of means could be expected to marry possibly 2, 3, 4 times in his lifetime. He was lucky enough to live to middle age. And I mean, it was even common to find men in their 70s marrying still, because it was just the whole danger of childbirth it might have even seemed like a 50-50 chance of survival in all too many cases. This remarkable document is a chronology of the Hutchison family of Stronocum and their land holdings from the time of George Hutchin, who settled in County Antrim in 1614, same year as Thomas of Carncogie. It also records the fact that a Thomas Boyd married his widow, Margaret Fulton, or Fullerton more likely, in 1622. This document is fantastic because although it's dated 1704, it catalogues every incident of land transaction regarding that piece of land in the Hutchison family all the way back to George, the progenitor. It hadn't really been identified until the last year or so, and I know that Peter Hutchison, who is a descendant of that family, was delighted to see this because it sort of gave us something relatively contemporary, and we do believe that the marriage to a Thomas Boyd of George Hutchin's widow is in all likelihood Thomas Boyd of Carncogie. Sadly, before Thomas's apparent death in 1634, we can record 2 unhappy incidents involving his stepdaughter, Janet Campbell. You can recall that he married Elizabeth Smeaton. She had been married to a Reverend Campbell, if you like. They had a grown-up, sort of semi-grown-up family, so he'd inherited a whole pile of stepdaughters. So in this case, Janet, who appears to have been caught up in allegations of bigamy, with 2 spouses mentioned in this and the following slide, as John Peebles and James Briding. Perhaps Thomas was unaware of arrangements made by Janet's father before his death. Anyhow, matters were resolved, but most importantly, for the purposes of our investigations, we can record that Thomas was residing in Carncogie in Antrim in May 1627. You can clearly see in the detail of this transaction. You'll get lots of spelling variants, but we can be fairly confident it's the same one. So this is the second transaction a few years later. This final one leading to the bigamy accusations confirms that by the 1st of November 1632, Thomas was still residing at Carncogie, but that his wife Elizabeth had obviously predeceased him, and we now know she probably died in 1621, that then letting him marry George Hutchinson's widow. So Thomas Boyd, Burgess and Provost of Irvine. So we know that Thomas of Carncogie of Antrim and Thomas Boyd, Burgess and Provost of Irvine, are the same person. More than enough evidence to back that up, but it still doesn't tell us where he's from. It's probably Ayrshire, but that's a big place, even in the 1600s. So, with the previous information, we had evidence suggesting that, obviously Thomas, he likely had family ties to Ayrshire, but where? Were the intriguing but limited connections to the hunters of Hunterston a clue? So why in all of Ayrshire does he seem to have some sort of a connection there? So geographically speaking, that might lead us. So, a search among the testaments, basically wills, for want of a better word, recorded in the Commissariat of Edinburgh, is an entry for Archibald Boyd of Portincross, dating from 1602. Thanks to the excellent transcription services of Diane Babty of Edinburgh, we were able to identify some curious entries amongst those named in the testament, i.e. sons, Robert down the bottom, who would be eldest and heir, and then we go on to the remaining sons, Thomas, Archibald and Hugh here. And by the way, we have an interesting one up here, John, his natural son. This would be a son born out of wedlock, but who has been legally adopted. He cannot inherit the family estates, but he is protected, and forgive my language, from the full legal rigours of bastardry, which you would not want to have been subject to, because it basically meant you could own anything. So by doing this, he has protected John from that legal process, if you like, but he cannot inherit in the family line. They can gift him, but he can't inherit. A further testament was found for Hugh Boyd, one of the brothers mentioned in the previous document, lawful son of the late Archibald of Portincross, and remarkably included amongst the text is reference to Archibald Boyd under the hill, his brother. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you, do you remember the two signatures from the Hunterston document? Who were the two witnesses to the document in 1609? Thomas Boyd, Provost of Irvine, and Archibald Boyd in Underhill. Now, there's only one Underhill. And where is it? It's about a very easy walk. Well, for somebody fit, not me. Yeah, Portincross. It's still colloquially known as Underhill even to this day. So, surely this is the Archibald in Underhill from just a year earlier who witnessed the Hunterston deed alongside Thomas Boyd Provost. But why does he not appear in the testament of what must surely be his brother Hugh? Thomas, that is, not Archibald. If, as we now suspect, Thomas Boyd, Provost of Irvine, 1606 to 10, was a brother of Hugh Boyd, and therefore son of Archibald of Portincross, why does he not appear in Hugh's testament? He's obviously a very important member of the family. Perhaps by way of explanation, we've already established some pertinent facts. We know that a Thomas Boyd received denization in January 1611-12. We know that the tenures of Irvine's provosts run from Whitsunday to Whitsunday, roughly August to August. Therefore, it's likely that by the time of Hugh's death in October 1610, Thomas was no longer provost, had he started to make plans to become involved in the Ulster plantation. He had probably made considerable wealth during his tenure as provost, and we have some record of that, and was now looking for investments. Before leaving this slide, could I also draw your attention to the mention of a debt owing to Hugh from a John Boyd in where? Glenarm, Ireland. And that's him there. Too much of a coincidence. We know that there was a natural son called John Boyd. Now, he would not be able to inherit anything directly from the family. They could keep him financially secure. But what is a son with that kind of background, if you like, likely to do? Make his own way in life elsewhere, with a degree of family protection. And we have evidence to sort of confirm that there was oversight from his brothers, but he was making his own way. And we think he may have made it here as early as 1595 to Glenarm. There's some evidence that suggests that. Yes, one of the things that was included was that Hugh included in the will was that he had 3 cows in Ireland. And that doesn't sound like a terrible, but if you knew the price of cattle even back then, it would scare them inside. So we were wondering, was one of John's responsibilities was to look after Hugh's mercantile interests in Antrim? I don't know. We can only really guess to a certain degree. So, bit of geography. This is us in Ballycastle. This is Carncogey down the road near Derrykeegan Church. And this is Portincross. And it's beside the village of, well, village stroke small town of West Kilbride in Ayrshire. And this, by the way, just off the coast, is Cumbrae Island. There's a little Cumbrae and a bigger Cumbrae. So you can see here that really in the grand scheme of Ulster and Scots migration dating back the best part of at least 1500 years plus, this is nothing more than a short hop. So it's no big surprise. We're not expecting somebody to travel half the globe to set up in County Antrim in 1611. It's literally a day's sail. It's not even that. Even back in 1600s. I've done it myself. So this is Portincross Castle. And I know I'm name dropping here with William, but it's his own fault for taking good photographs. So we think Portincross was probably built in the 1300s. It's a typical Scottish tower house. It was restored under grant funding a few years back, and it's maintained by a charitable group called the Friends of Portincross. And Adrian and I were over about 10 days ago delivering a sort of another version of this talk to the folk in West Kilbride. It's a fantastic location, and we did it when that crazy weather started. So it was like looking across the Mediterranean when we went up onto the roof here, looking out. It did not look like the west coast of Scotland. Beautiful as it is, it was totally surreal. Those are 3D mock-ups of what the house would have looked like, and then a section taken through the house of the various rooms and a banqueting suite and all that sort of thing. So it's actually a very deceptive place. It's a lot larger when you get into it. That was the thing. I usually find when I go to see places in the flesh for the first time, I'm imagining, well, if I can tell you this, and please no English people be insulted, particularly if you're a Londoner, but the first time I climbed out of the tube station and saw Big Ben, I went, oh, I was completely underwhelmed. I mean, it's still a marvel, and don't get me wrong, I wanted to see it, but I sort of imagined it was going to be the height of the Empire State Building for some stupid reason. But anyhow. Okay. So, putting some of that information down in a graphical form by way of a family tree sort of helps us map out this Boyd family. So, at the head of it at this particular juncture is Archibald Boyd, we believe, 5th Laird of Portincross. His wife Elizabeth Fairley of that ilk. Their eldest son Robert would go on to be the 6th Laird, married Jean Montgomery of Skilmorley. Here we have Thomas, originally married Catherine Peebles, buried Derrykeegan, 1615. Second wife Elizabeth Smeaton of Irvine, who probably died in Carncogey in 1621. And his third wife Margaret, we've no more detail on Margaret, but Thomas in the Inquisitions is recorded as died in 1634. We records that his eldest son was Hugh, and there was also mention in records of Thomas Boyd. We also now know from another record from 1657 that the in-between son was George. Also, Archibald Boyd, the brother, we now suspect is Archibald Boyd of Carnculla in County Antrim. It looks like he followed his brother over a few years later. And we think that he is the progenitor that gets mentioned in the Hutchison bequest. But I haven't time to go into that tonight because that's a huge story in its own right. So before I move on, I wanted to touch on another Boyd where there seems to be a connection, but it's very difficult to nail down. And that's William Boyd of Dunluce. Now he featured amongst Hill's 19th century local histories of North Antrim. So I just want to go into the reasons why. First of all, there is an awful lot of archival and documentation for Ireland's history that was lost in the forecourts. Some of it they're making efforts to try and recover by other means, but a lot of it can never be recovered. But one of the things that seems to have survived, at least for a while, was the will of William Boyd of Dunluce from 1624. It was proved in 1628. It records who his family was, it records who the executors were, mentions his wife, Maggle Martin. He seemed to have a reasonable amount of wealth, probably a merchant, had one or two properties in the town of Dunluce that existed at that time, and has only relatively recently been rediscovered through archaeology. Fantastic finds. So it's a fascinating will because it's about 2 or 3 pages long, goes into a lot of detail, but there are elements in it that we know connects to what we're already following, because this boy here is mentioned in it, as you're about to find out, 5 times. Now this has led us and many others to wonder if there's a connection between them. They're both called Boyd. He at no time calls Thomas his brother, and by the way, this boy ends up in it as well. Archibald Boyd of Carnculla. We think the possibility is they are related. In Scots culture at that time, they would use terms such as brother, father, mother, grandfather, or good father, as they would sometimes say. They would use terms such as brother German. They might say cousin German. There was no Scots language for anything else. There was no Scots language for half-brothers, half-sisters. There was no Scots language for second cousin, third cousin, fourth cousin, just not recorded. But they did have one annoying habit, which lasted a long time. They used the word friend a lot. And more often than not, this was used to denote a familial connection of some kind, probably of the second, third, or whatever cousinal connection. But they just used friend. They didn't give it a name. And in fact, even in Irish history, you'll struggle to find the use of those terms. They're relatively modern. But he up here describes William Dunlop and Thomas as faithful and trusty friends. Down here, Thomas says, whereof Thomas Boyd of Carncogie to be one. These are specially chosen elements of the witnesses that are given specific roles of importance. One of those was to be the guardian of one of William of Dunluce's daughters. And down here, it keeps coming back to whereof Thomas Boyd and Mr. William Wallace, by the way, as a local minister, shall be too. So Thomas has a really elevated role in this will. You'd nearly swear he has to be his brother, but at no time does William of Dunluce ever say that. He does of a sister, Isabel, who is mentioned, and I think brother-in-law, John Logan of Bush Mills. But again, brother-in-law, you'll not see that term used either. So, to be honest with DNA, John might be the only thing that ever answers that question. I don't know. But for now, I'm willing to believe, because of the very elevated role that Thomas has in this will, that there's obviously some sort of a connection there, but whether we'd ever be lucky enough to put a name on it, I don't know. This is just from a website that's a wonderful dictionary of Scots language going back centuries. And you can see here the word friend, one of its terms, a relative, a blood relation, a kinsman, etc., etc. So it's likely there is a relationship, but they're not going to define it in modern language the way we would understand it. So finally, I just wanted to show this. Now this is an excerpt from the 2007 publication, Hugh Boyd's Ballycastle, that Danny McGill and others in the group at the time that were put together to produce it. Jane's here tonight. Thank you, Jane. She'll keep me right. So it suggests the alternate origin to the Boyds of Ballycastle by way of William of Dunluce. And there's an alternative line or chain of evidence. Danny had noted that the name Adam appeared quite regularly through the chain of the Ballycastle family. It doesn't tend to appear much else, and it doesn't appear in the Portincross family that we know of. And that's an important clue, because naming conventions matter. It's not an absolute slam dunk in base basketball parlance, but there's a couple of clues here, and I'm content that what's more likely is the case. It could be either William, it could be Thomas, but the point is, if the two of them are both related to the same ancestral line, it really doesn't actually matter. It's all coming from the same source, which is likely to be the Portincross family. So, rather unusually, I'm going to begin the main part of the talk That was sort of by way of introduction. As a family story of two families, the McNeils and the Boyds, through a series of crises. And it's to try and relate sort of real world understanding of a family in the 1600s through the 1700s and what they sort of come up against. This, by the way, this image is the seal used by Rose Boyd in a document of 1696. And it clearly shows the McNeil arms that would be understood as the McNeils of Gea, historically speaking. From the late 14th century, the McNeils appear to have come from Tainish in Argyll and Bute in Scotland. For a period, they were keepers of Castle Sween before settling on the island of Gea. That's Castle Sween up here, and then Gea down here. By the late 16th century, we appear to have a Hugh McNeil, son to Neil McNeil, and Neil's described in histories as a natural son. So the story of the McNeils here begins with this man. So the first sort of evidence we find for Hugh is actually from a series of documents called the Faints of Elizabeth I. That's how far back we're going. This is the late 1500s, okay? So forget about the Ulster, plantation. That's a pipe dream at the minute. So he is a number of sort of Scots, Ayrshire, Hebrides, whatever, that have links to the north coast. I mean, historically speaking, you're going nearly back as far as, well, you are going back as far as Dalriada. So that's 5th, 6th century onwards sort of thing. But here we can clearly see first appearance on record, 22nd of January 1587-88, named as Hugh McNeil. He appears alongside Randolph McNeice. Now, you'll see that says McChonnell, and Sorley McNeice McChonnell, that's McDonald's. It's just the way it's been transcribed. And Donald McNeil. There are further appearances in the Faints on the 25th of June 1601 and the 18th of May 1602. So it's looking like Hugh has been here for anything from 10 to 15 years before we even get to 1600. Then we see the first document, and it's dated the 27th of December 1605. Copy fee farm from Randall MacDonald to Hugh McNeil, gentleman of the constableship and keeping of the fort of Dunanini, quarter land of Clare Castle, 5 acres of Craigmore, 5 acres of Port British in Ballycastle. Rent £3. Oh, wouldn't you love to have that today? Courts, Leighton Baron, custom markets, etc. Blah, blah, blah. So I've just done a wee bit of a townland map. Obviously, this is Ballycastle, where we are today. Port British here, Fort of Dunanini, and the quarter land of Clare Castle. And this is a wee image just showing the ruins of Dunanini from the 1832 Ordnance Survey, first edition. And this is it today with the caravan park backing onto it. So it's this precarious triangular promontory. There's not really anything to see. And to be honest with you, I wouldn't risk my life going to even look at it. I'll leave that to the daredevil archaeologists, Nick. So moving things on a little more, about 6 years, we can look at the lands conveyed by the Earl of Antrim to Hugh McNeil in 1611 and some of the naming conventions. By the way, if anyone has any ideas about the land referred to as Craigmore, I'd love to hear from you. It was probably coastal, but I haven't found anything bringing up to the modern era that can tie it into its exact location. It's the only one I can't locate. But I've numbered these in the table here in the map as you see it here. So this part of Ballycastle is now referred to as town parks, was originally broken up into half a dozen different small sort of quarter lands at this sort of time. And I mean, some of these names have survived in local language and some of them haven't. But this was a further grant to Hugh McNeil. So he's on the up and up, he's doing well. So this is the line of descent of the McNeils of Dunanini, as Adrian and I have found, and Ballycastle, and it's fairly well evidenced. And a descendant tree can be suggested accordingly. So we have Hugh, we've Neil Og, Hector and Lachlan. We have evidence for all of those. Then Donal, who would become Daniel, just anglicised, Madeline, his wife, Alexander McNeill, who would have a role in one of the family crises, Hugh McNeill, Bernard, and then Rose, who would marry Reverend William Boyd, and that's where the Boyd connection begins. So 1679-80, we reckon, was probably the time when Rose McNeill married Reverend William Boyd of Lade and Ramone. He was installed into Lade in 1679. Average age for an installation for an Anglican priest at that time was 21. So it's a crude rule of thumb, but it's all you're going to get. You're not going to get a list of, installation records. Very, very rare. So he was probably born about 1657, 1658. 1684-85 was likely the death of Daniel McNeill, and late Danny writes, Hugh's father Daniel had died in 1684 or 5, and renewal licenses from Lord Antrim appoint Alexander McNeill as trustee for the estate on behalf of Hugh McNeill, son and heir of Daniel McNeill. Then 1st of September 1685, we see a grant from the Earl of Antrim to Hugh McNeill of Clare Castle, granting Dunanini forever, in return for McNeill relinquishing his claim to the village and castle of Ballycastle, now in the actual possession of the said Hugh McNeill or his brother Bernard. Now, wonderfully, that is Hugh's signature from the deed of 1685, which is always nice to see. So, crisis number 1. 25th of March 1689, attainted by James II and the Irish Parliament in Dublin through an act of attainder, various persons, including one Captain Hugh McNeill of Clare, County Antrim. 25th of March 1689 to June 1690 was likely the time that Hugh died, possibly in the siege of Derry or its aftermath, or with the forces of Duke Schomberg, who lost over 6,000 men to disease and malnutrition, whilst waiting for reinforcements before engaging James II. So again, just referring back to an article that Danny had written back in 2002, I think it was. On Hugh's death, one would have expected that the normal procedure of issuing a renewal licence would occur, transferring the estate to Hugh's brother Bernard. Instead, we have an indenture dated the 10th of June 1690, transferring the estate to William Boyd. The indenture was drawn up between Bernard of Clare Castle and the barony of Kerry. Deceased brother, in the lifetime by his last will and testament, did bequeath and make over to the said William Boyd all his estates real and personal, which said will and testament is mislaid or casually lost. In fairness, the time period is horrendous. It's the Williamite Wars. This is no normal time. Nobody knows what they're doing from one day to the next. It's chaos. So it really, if there's ever going to be a chaotic moment in the family's legal papers, this is going to be it. This is like the beginning of World War II. The indenture provides for the payment of alleged debts and mortgages held by Andrew Boyd, Adam Boyd and the James Massey, witness signatories to the deed, with cash payments to the said Bernard, the sum of £10, and a further yearly payment of £20. And proviso stated that it should be the said Bernard McNeill remain with the said William Boyd and be maintained by him. And I want you to bear that in mind. Remain with William Boyd and be maintained by him. So what's happening there? Meat, lodging and clothes, then the annual sum would not be payable. So there's something wrong, in addition to the fact that Hugh has died suddenly, plunging the family into crisis. There is a remaining male heir called Bernard, but what's all this about meat and lodging and remaining with? So, as Danny had put, this may be the clue we're looking for. The fact that Bernard was a party to the deed in his own right suggests to me that he'd reached his majority, but was incapable of looking after himself or managing the affairs of his estate. It appeared that the deed was unacceptable because the next document in the archive is a letter of administration from Thomas Ward for William and Rose Boyd, dated the 29th of October 1690. Now again, bear in mind that date. You know, this is just months after the Battle of the Boyne. The war's still not over. We might have an idea where it's going, but it's not over yet. So Danny writes further, within a few days of this, another indenture dated the 3rd of November 1690 is drawn up. So basically, there's still a confusing picture. The deed lists alleged debts owed by Hugh McNeill to the sum of £504, 4 shillings. This is 1690. That would literally be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds today. Okay? And then it lists the various people who are owed money. The deed also refers to the lost will, whereas the said Hugh McNeill by his last will and testament directed the said William Boyd to satisfy and pay the same out of profits of his estate. Another line says that the will which, by the distraction of the late times, lovely way to describe open warfare, is mislaid or lost. The function of the lost will appears to be for the sole purpose of supporting the existence of the alleged debts by the late Hugh McNeill. William Lawley and Charles Stewart, by a concurrent deed, transfer the estate to William Rose for 5 shillings. Now, even in 1690, you're thinking, right, that's a bit small. They receive the quarter lands of Shrewin and Galmore, Knockins and Monancloy as payment for their portion of the debts allegedly owed by them by Bernard McNeill, thus completing the transfer of the estate into the possession of William and Rose Boyd. So you don't need to be a lawyer to look at that and say to yourself, this is as messy as it gets. What on earth is going on? Most of the land deals you see coming from the Earl of Antrim, from the very beginning of his plantation, if you like, of 1603, generally follow the topic of the day, male heirship. So father to son, to son, to son, ad nauseum. And there's no reason to suppose this wouldn't have been any different. But we've got a problem. Dad dies, eldest son dies, next son is incapable of taking on the heirship. So how do they get out of that? And there's a war going on. There's no question of taking a wee run down the road to Dublin and having it out with the courts and say, look, can we come to say, it's mayhem. And I think that's really probably what we're seeing here. There's desperation involved. There's a lot of land involved, a fairly important estate. If they get it wrong, the whole family is destitute. So I think they've coddled it together the best that they can. But as we shall see, it won't really matter in the end. So we get now, so the McNeill, if you like, they're not all gone, but if you like, the male hereditary line has gone or is in the process of dying out. Bernard would be the last of that line. So this is now the story of the Boyds of Ballycastle. Oh, and if you thought the crises were over, no. We're only just getting started. So this is crisis number 2. So, on the 30th of October 1686, Reverend William Boyd of Ramone lends £300 to John Kennedy of Moss Side, possibly a mill venture of some kind. In 1699, him and Rose's daughter Elizabeth is married to Richard Jackson of Coleraine, a wealthy and influential English family who've been based in Coleraine for quite some time. 2nd of March 1702, we have the death of Reverend William Boyd of Ramone. So we're just 10 years after, things are settling down after the war, and suddenly the Reverend is gone. 1703, the likely death of his eldest son, Adam. It just keeps on happening. 1703, Richard Jackson is appointed Hugh's guardian until Hugh reaches his majority, likely 1711. On the 29th of January 1703, Widow Rose takes John Kennedy of Moss Side to Chancery Court to recover the 1686 loan plus interest. 3rd of February 1707-8, administration is granted in the estate of Madeline, you remember the mother, her mother, to Rose Boyd, widow, the daughter. This is almost certainly mum. 4th of February 1707-8 to 809, likely marriage of Rose Boyd, widow of Reverend William Boyd, to a James Boyd of Cullabaccy. Up until relatively recently, the considered opinion was that Rose predeceased her husband and that Reverend William Boyd married a second time. That is wrong. Danny found that out many, many years ago when he found the will. That was a game changer. So when you discovered the will amongst the legal papers, we knew that all the previous line was all wrong. We couldn't ignore the will. So in March 1708-9, John Kennedy countersues Rose Boyd, Hugh Boyd and Richard Jackson. 1709 in July, the outstanding loan to John Kennedy of Moss Side plus interest amounting to £741 was paid by Roth Jones of Dublin to Rose Boyd and Richard Jackson, with John Kennedy's property at Moss Side being transferred. So Richard Jackson concocted a beautiful arrangement whereby Rose didn't lose any money, John Kennedy of Mosside got off the hook because Roth Jones, who was a wealthy Dublin financier, took the land off him. Everybody was happy, well, probably except John Kennedy of Mosside, who lost everything. But Rose was not left destitute. That was a very significant amount of money to save the family's bacon, because bear in mind, it's 2 years before Hugh's majority. So she is. Adrian and I came away from this whole period regarding Rose as an absolute giant. I mean, I know there's a lot of modern talk about, female stereotypes and all the rest of it. We have a fairly good idea that Rose Boyd may have been as young as 13 and probably no more than 15 when she married the Reverend William Boyd. Because to still be having children in 1708 after the first one was born in 1680 meant that she had to be extremely young. Now, that shocks us today, but I would remind you that the legal age for marriage did not change in the United Kingdom until 1885. It was 13. Extremely rare, and it required so many caveats and legal oversights, but it comes from the Middle Ages. Now, I mentioned there the will of William Boyd of Ramone. That was certainly like a pivotal moment. I can only imagine what it was like when you see that for the first time. I know how we felt when we seen it for the first time. It is remarkable to have a will in Ireland last from any length of time from 300 years ago, but this survived in the Boyd papers, and it is indeed the will of Reverend William Boyd of Ramone. And that's the bottom half of the will. You can see his signature here. This is the administration of the will, about 6 months later, I think it was. Here we have his eldest son Adam as a witness, Daniel O'Reilly, Richard Jackson, who would be the guardian to the young Hugh, and James Boyd, his brother. Now this introduced a real cat amongst the pigeons. I did say to you that Rose married a James Boyd of Cullybackey. That's all I can tell you. I can't tell you that she married a brother-in-law, because legally that's not possible. Okay? It goes all the way back to Bible teachings and Leviticus and Deuteronomy and everything else. I'm not a canon law expert, but I've looked at enough, and it generally seems to forbid it, except in the situations that in the first marriage no children were produced. Do we all remember our Henry VIII? What was Henry's excuse for ditching Catherine of Aragon? She had slept with the brother Arthur, and therefore, that's it. She had slept with my brother, and that, was against Christian teachings and blah, blah, blah. But there is another possibility that we can't overlook. This James Boyd may not be his blood brother. He may be his half-brother. Because this is a big problem in those days. Your father is marrying 2, 3 times. You end up with a clutch of 3 different sets of siblings who are related through their father but with different mothers. So you get these half-brothers all the time, and I have no idea how canon law deals with that, because that's complete off the field. Rose Boyd's second marriage. So let's look at the evidence. So we know that out of this second marriage were Reverend Charles Boyd, initially of Rathlin and then Killowen and Kilrain, Alexander Boyd of Clare Park, and then an Anne Boyd. The first piece of strong evidence was the Trinity College Dublin entrance or matriculation for Charles, which clearly states Filius, Latin for son, Jacobi, James, Generosi, gentlemen. It's not William. So we know that Charles's father was James. We do know the mother was Rose. And then another piece of evidence was a baptismal book of Alexander Boyd for his children to Anne Wilson of Carrickfergus. And if we see here, his son Hugh, born on the 21st November 1746, sister Charlotte Orr was godmother, brother Hugh Boyd, and brother William Wilson, godfathers. Do you see a Hugh Boyd here? No. So what Hugh Boyd's he talking about? It's 1746. There's only one Hugh Boyd it could be, Hugh Boyd of Ballycastle. But he's a half-brother. Same mother, 2 different fathers. William was born on 29th March 1748. His uncles William Boyd of Cullybackey and William Boyd of Drumawillen. again, the Ballycastle connection. So, this James of Cullybackey had married previously. There is a hint that she might have been called Mary or Margaret, maybe with a surname beginning K. But William Boyd of Cullybackey definitely existed and was alive after 1749. So he was standing godfather to this son William of Alexander. But again, half brothers. Okay? But he calls them uncles anyway. So just ignore the half brother bit. Belfast newsletter, this confirmed again the Cullybackey thing. This is 4 years after the death of Alexander Boyd of Clare Park, and we can clearly see his executor Ezekiel Davies Wilson is selling a whole stream of 600 acres of land in Cullybackey, which we can link to James Boyd of Cullybackey. So why would he have land of James Boyd of Cullybackey if he didn't inherit it from his father? So there's lots of associated bits of evidence that allow us to confirm that second marriage. So Hugh Boyd's early years and crisis number 3. Now, this has probably given Jane heartburn, because I know it gave Adrian and I heartburn for weeks on end. Can anybody make sense of this document? Any lawyers in the audience tonight? No? Okay, I'm going to give you some clues. What language do you think it's in? And a fiver for anybody who says hieroglyphics, because that's what I thought. Well, I'll put you out of your misery. It's Latin. Okay? Do you see anything wrong with it? Apart from the fact that nobody can read it. There's no spaces between the words. There's no paragraphs. I mean, if you wrote that in primary school, it would have taken the head off you 30, 40 years ago. What we can tell is it's indented. You see this seascape up the top? And do you see the little characters that are put close to where the tear is made? So this would have come in 3 parts. So there'd been the part here, a part above, and a part to the side. So those 3 parts would go to the parties of this indented deed. But it's a very, very special deed. The way that it's written is in what's known as court hand, a form of writing that was outlawed by an act of parliament in the 1730s because it caused so many problems. Because more often than not, the only blessed people who could read it were the court scribes that wrote it down. And that caused no end of ill feeling and bad blood. So by an act of parliament in the 1730s, I think 1735, this method of recording was outlawed forever. So luckily for me, after a lot of soul searching and frustration and long nights on the internet, I found a wonderful lady called Dr. Claire Jarvis. And you can see she has a lot of letters after her name, which I would never see in my lifetime, no matter how hard I try. But she's a specialist in transcribing medieval Latin. Okay? She did this in less than a day. And what she was able to tell me actually before she even started doing it, oh, that's a Concorde. And I went, well, it's obviously not the plane you're talking about. And she said, no, this is a very important, very old medieval form of land transaction. And it's called a final Concorde. Again, I think they're probably outlawed today. So what had actually happened here was in 1715, a relatively young Hugh Boyd, he would have been 25, was probably in a great state of heightened anxiety about the whole mess of the land that we've seen during the Williamite Wars. That this might come back and bite him big time. And plenty of McNeil families still living in County Antrim. Somebody might contest how things had gone. You know that his guardian was Richard Jackson. Richard Jackson was hugely well connected in Dublin, and one of the people he was well connected with was a man called Michael Ward, who would go on to be a kind of friend and confidant of Hugh's, and by the way, a High Court judge, and quite famous in Irish legal history. So in this final Concorde, what they do is that Hugh bundles up the entire Boyd estate, previously McNeil, right down to the point where it's described as 2 castles, 300 messages, 200 cottages, 200 stables, 50 granaries, 1 mill, 200 gardens, 20 orchards, 1,000 acres of land, 400 acres of meadow, 1,000 acres of pastures, wood, blah, 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 and then describes all the old town land names associated with it. Oh, and by the way, even the fisheries and the markets and when they happen into one bundle, and he hands it to Michael Ward for nothing. No money changes hands. After that, in one transaction, Michael Ward gives it straight back to Hugh. I am explained to me that in the final concord, this creates a brand new and superseding legal transaction that renders all previous legal transactions involving this property null and void. It's like they never happened. That was the whole point of a final concord. And they were in use in the Middle Ages for centuries. It was obviously still legal. It's placed before John Forster, Esquire, Gilbert Dolben, Baronet, James McCartney, Esquire, Justices, and other faithful of the Lord King then there present. So the whole thing was done legally, due above board in Dublin before appointed Justices of the Bench. Absolutely fantastic. So this spider scrawl that we couldn't recognise is actually the most pivotal document of the entire family's legal history. It's quite incredible that it's buried away there and it's finally revealed itself to us 309 years later. So that's how Hugh dealt with that crisis. So he now feels buoyed up, confident, and he can get on with his own projects. And you're all living here today with the outworkings of those projects, the town of Ballycastle as it stands. And I mean, a lot of that is built on the industrial build-up that's planted here. Yes, lots of stuff comes along long after he's dead in 1765. But I think it's probably reasonable to argue that he's the one that sort of sets that in motion. But he could not have done that, I don't think, if he hadn't put the other bit to bed once and for all. It gave him the confidence to move on. He was more business oriented, but the land was his legacy from his mother. It meant everything. So how does he celebrate this? He celebrates it with this monument in 1727, which again caused a lot of confusion because everybody felt that was when Reverend William Boyd of Ramone died. But we know Danny and Jane found the will, that was rubbish. It was 25 years odd later. So in it, he says, this monument is erected by Hugh Boyd, son of Reverend William Boyd, by Rose, daughter and heir of Daniel McNeill, late of Clare, Esquire, chosen in memory of grandfather and father, who, together with many children and grandchildren, were deposited below in the year AD 1727. Now, this was in the old Ramone church on the wall originally, before 1830. It's now in St James's Church. Thankfully, it was moved there and protected, so it's on the wall of the newer parish church now. I want to just draw your attention to this bit up here on the memorial. So this is the seal of Rose Boyd from 1696, and it is the pure arms of Gaea, the McNeills of Gaea. Now, this is Hugh's monument to his parents. Only one part is Boyd, the first quarter, and it's the three crescents that you would recognise in Ballycastle today and the checkered fish. The other 3 quarters is McNeill. Now, that's a very powerful way of saying that you know what your legacy came from, and it's the McNeill family. That's how important that McNeill legacy was to him, his relationship, I think, particularly to his mother. Now, it doesn't mean that he had no relationship to his father, but I think that this is testament to where his sense of belonging is. Now, over time, he really establishes the Boyd name and the 3 crescents and the checkered fish. You see it in windows and all sorts of things. But at this point of time in 1727, he is 37. He's really starting to launch things in Ballycastle in a commercial way, but he's looking back with a very sense of gratitude to what his mother effectively has done for him. So, the French Connection, not the movie, obviously. You're saying to yourself, how does this come into it? Back in 2009, Danny and Jane attended a symposium in Danson House, been organised by Bexley Council, Huguenot societies of Great Britain and Ireland and South Carolina and others. And there were various academics there as well as Danny and Jane, Vivian Costello, people like that. And archives that had been found by Danny and Jane and others from America, there was a meeting of minds done on the internet, really, as much as anything, because everything was at a distance, where all these documents started to make a lot of sense. And this was kind of the central point around this coming together of archives and people who'd been researching, was this family tree. It was referred to, I think, Jane, as Judith's tree. But it actually, the top of the tree is the youngest member, Edward Moore Jr. But it goes all the way down the tree, Judith and Edward Moore, her father George, his father George, son of Archibald Boyd, Lord of Portincross. Now, Adrian and I started researching in 2019, we'll say, for the sake of argument. 10 years earlier, Danny and Jane found this, totally unbeknownst to each other. So 2 separate lines of research, we hadn't made contact with each other until relatively recently, had actually found similar pieces of evidence. Quite credible. If the evidence is there, it'll get found, no matter who by, it will get found. But you never know what's going to turn up next. This appeared as recently as June of this year. And it's a page from a manuscript volume in the Lord Lyon's office in Edinburgh in Scotland. And it's either a birth breve or a genealogy, officially recorded by the then Lord Lyon, Alexander Erskine, who, by the way, was 40 years in the job, and prior to him, his father about another 20. So between the two of them, there was about 60 years of experience in Scottish heraldry and genealogy. Quite a background. But he records, at the request of a gentleman called George Boyd, merchant in Bordeaux in the Kingdom of France, this lineage. Now, the reason for this is probably George is looking to do stronger business in Scotland. He doesn't want to be treated as an outsider. He wants to firmly point out to the authorities in Scotland, but I'm actually Scottish. Ignore the fact I was born in Bordeaux. I am from an ancient and noble line in Scotland. So he goes to the authority at the time, literally the legal authority. Heraldry was legally registrable from 1690 in Scotland. So there was no ducking around the Lord Lyon's office. If you got the nod and wink from the Lord Lyon's office, it carried considerable weight. So what does he say? The Lord Lyon says, and make known and certain the distinguished nobility of the aforesaid George Boyd, whose paternal grandfather George Boyd was the lawful son of George, the youngest lawful son of the most honourable man, and Lord Sir Archibald Lord Boyd of Portincross in the province of Cunningham, etc., etc. Then it goes on to describe the arms as Archibald Erskine would understand them. Quite a find, and it kind of backs up Judith's tree. I don't think the two were written at the same time. The Judith's tree looks to be dated from the 1720s, similar time, by the spelling of the name Bristol with 2 L's. That tended to go out of fashion by the mid-1700s. I think Judith's tree is a family document drawn up by then, just to keep. But this is serious, official, almost legal, for want of a better word. So if we look at what Archibald Erskine believed, what he believed the arms of Portincross is, we have the standard Kilmarnock arms, which is azure background with a checkered fish, red and white. Normally just Confido would be the motto, but he says in their case it has a border wavy in gold, or in Latin. And the motto is Virtute Confido. Okay? Now, let's look at Judith's tree. We have a bit of differentiation in colours, but look what's above in the banner, Virtute Confido. The Boyd motto is Confido on its own. Very much strongly coincidental. But bear in mind, this was probably developed in France in the 1720s. And then George Robertson, a well-known Ayrshire historian, recorded what he believed to be the Boyd of Portincross arms, which unfortunately is not in colour, but it's what we call Kilmarnock with a border. That's not coincidental either. Now, you're saying here, what are you going to be able to dig up from France that's going to lock this in, that it's not just romantic nonsense? You're looking at the baptismal record of George marriage record of George Boyd and Anne Bibeau in the Temple Saint-Jean, La Rochelle, on the 12th of February 1619. That's how old you can get French records back to. It's quite remarkable. 2 years later, roughly a year and a half, 2 years later, 19th of February 1621, same church, Huguenot church, Temple Saint-Jean, we have the baptism of Johann. Now the minister was Dutch, so he's using the Germanic form of John. So it's not Jean or John, it's Johann. Son of George Boyd and Anne Bibeau, godfather John Vaughan, and godmother Marie, I think it's Gautret, but I've never been able to quite nail it down. So we can start putting a family tree together of these French Boyds. So we know there's a connection to Portincross. This would be the first one, and he is the youngest son of Archibald. So he has a son, George, who marries firstly Anne Bibeau and the children Jean, who marries Jean Passot and Anne. He marries secondly Marie Chaperon, and he has children Judith, who we see the tree, marries Edward Moore Sr. of Bristol, George Jr. and Sarah. All of which we have French contemporary records for from the registers, which is quite incredible. This had been mentioned at Dancing Hill, and I luckily managed from a French Canadian who was in La Rochelle the day that I contacted him by some stroke of miracle, is a charter party whereby George Boyd, the second George Boyd in La Rochelle back in 1635, is chartering a boatload of wine with a Captain White to be routed to Dublin and then on to Scotland. And this is Hugh Boyd's signature. Now, Adrian and I are relatively confident that that's the son of Thomas Boyd of Corncogey. There are very few Hugh Boyds about at that time in Scottish records or anywhere else. It's too much of a coincidence. Irvine was importing and exporting wine amongst other things. You wouldn't believe the amount of trade going on with Europe at that time, even across the Atlantic. It's quite remarkable. Bear in mind that Canada was being colonised by the French around this time. So the boat's called the Don de Dieu, the gift of God. Unfortunately, a very common name for boats coming out of France at that time. But it's incredible to have that whole document. Now, this is a sad aspect to the whole thing. So these French Boyds had moved from La Rochelle to Bordeaux. And by the time we get to 1685, if you know your history, we're looming on the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Not a good country to be if you're a Protestant worshipper. It was probably nearest to hell on earth as you're going to get. In this first document, Jean Boyd, who you've seen born in 1621, is giving what's known as his abjuration. He is confessing before a court official that he rebukes the heresies of Calvin and all the other heresies which were and are condemned by the Catholic, Apostolic and Roman Church, and that I embrace all of the virtues of the faith which it teaches, wishing to live and die faithful to it. He had to do this. What most of them did was they tried to get their children offside. They would stay behind, they would abjure, they would practice the Roman Catholic faith as minimalistic as they could get away with it. They'd still have to do it. But there was an extra dagger in the side. Just a few months later, he's forced to be subjected to an interrogation by a church official acting on behalf of the state. And he's questioned about who he is, where he came from, and is he behaving himself? So this is in February 1686. Now by this time, Jean has managed to spirit most of the children away and his wife, but there are still a few children that remain behind. This document is a last cry for help, in a way. It's dated 1686, and it's from Jean to a man called James Fraser, who was either in London at the time or Edinburgh, we can't really be sure. But this letter survives, I think, in Edinburgh University archives. And basically it's a plea for a passport to help get him out of the country, under a ruse that he's actually Scottish. Although Jean was born in 1621 in La Rochelle, He was actually educated and looked after by the Scottish family until he was about 20, and he claimed that in his statement under interrogation. Whether he thought that was enough to get him offside, I don't know, but it's a really heartfelt plea in the letter, but unfortunately it didn't come to fruition, and he would die 10 years later. Now, some of the children embarked on a Huguenot refugee ship to South Carolina, and they headed to a part of South Carolina known as French Santee, or Sante the Day. And these two ladies here, Sheaves Leland and Dee Ressinger, of the Huguenot Society of South Carolina. This is a picture of them taking a trip up the local river to the location of the Santee settlement. And this is a wee just memorial stone to the Huguenot settlement in Santee. Jean's son, Jean, had already married in France by that time and had a few children, possibly one or two more, when they were in the colony in South Carolina. They had a very difficult time. A lot of the Huguenots found it difficult to settle in. There were English colonists there. They were kind of people without a country. And a mixture of things, face didn't fit, trying to settle into growing crops in a different climate, all the other things that all colonists run into, disease of different types, missing home. And no one bear in mind that back home your father was being literally put through hell. There are a lot of awful aspects to the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, but one of the things I always try to tell people about is possibly for me the worst. Huguenots were not legally allowed to bury their dead. A lot of people say, well, how did they get round that? They buried them in the woods at night, and hopefully they didn't get found out. If the authorities found they'd done it, they were rebuked in whatever legal fashion was fitting under the laws, and their loved ones were dug up and left on the surface to rot. It was a horrendous time. The Dragonades were camped in probably the homes of influential Huguenots to basically keep an eye on them. They lived with them. So you had your own personal military escort that lived in your house. Terrible, terrible times. Jean Jr. writes home, to London to his daughter, his sister Madeline, of the expedition to Santee in South Carolina. This incredible letter survives, I think, again in Edinburgh University records. He records a map of the settlement, and these are botanical drawings that he did of some of the plants. Absolutely not expecting anything like this. From what he has run from, that he's even time to think like that just beggars belief. But he was probably hoping it was a new life, it was going to amount to something. Now, he didn't stay, and certainly his son didn't stay. Jean Jr. came to live in Dublin and died bankrupt in Dublin in 1717. Quite badly. There was a whole fight amongst family about who would, administrate the will. But his son, Jean Augustus Boyd, went to the island of St. Christopher, known today as St. Kitts. He got work there on the plantations. He married the daughter of a local judge, Lucy, and eventually he did well enough to put together his own estate called Fountain. And you can see here in this old 1730s map of St. Christopher, the Fountain Boyd plantation. The capital, Bassetiere, is sort of down to the south of this. And you can see there Augustus Boyd, Esquire. Now, we've got some pictures. So, this is Jean Boyd Jr. So, his father had died in France in 1696. And as I say, he died in Dublin in 1717. This is his son, Jean Augustus Boyd, known more frequently as Augustus Boyd. And this would be grandson then, John Boyd, 2nd Baronet, Danson Hill. So I touched on Waterford at the start. This is from a newspaper clipping of the time. And we can see that Augustus Boyd had set up a sugar refinery in Waterford in 1751. And this is just about a change in ownership. Originally it was tripartite ownership with a man called Simon Bouygues, probably another Huguenot. And he was leaving to leave just Augustus and Paul running the sugar refinery themselves. Augustus, though, would move on to London, a more lucrative finances and leave Paul to do, but Paul joined him in London not long after. So in 1804, we see after one of the descendants of these French Boyds is granted a baronetcy, okay, in 1775. In the baronetage of England, we record the Danson Hill baronetcy. And you can see at 1804, we've got Sir John Boyd, the first one, John Augustus Boyd. There we have Lucy Peters. Remember I mentioned he married a Lucy? And this is us going sort of back up the line to the Georges. Oh, and in case we forgot, Archibald, Laird or Lord of Portincross. Now, there were some of the children stayed behind in France and managed to survive the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, basically outlived Louis XIV. And one of those Boyds purchased land outside Bordeaux in the area known as Cantagnac in 1754. It is a vineyard still there till this day. It's owned by the Gilmet family, I think since 1932. And this is a picture of a bottle of Chateau Boyd Cantagnac. It's considered an exceptional Grand Cru red wine of the region. And the cheapest bottle, Adrian, correct me, is 40 quid, up to 95 and keep going, depending on the vintage. It's connoisseurs know about it. But that was founded by a member of the family in 1754. So we come to the end and the final crisis of the Boyd. You'd think that this was enough. But no, it's not. And in some ways, this is the worst tragic end you could have possibly imagined for the family. So I've tried to put this in terms of a family tree to explain it. So we now know we've got this Boyd of Portincross background. You can see here we're running the two theories, if you like, side by side. So we suspect that William Boyd is connected into the Boyds of Portincross at some point, maybe at that generational level or another one. We don't know. But we think there's too many clues to suggest there's not a fairly strong relationship. And then there's the, if you like, the conventional one from Burke's coming down through Thomas Provost, Hugh Boyd, Reverend William, blah, 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 and so forth. But we get down to this generation. And this man here, the heir in the late 1700s, dies at only 30 years of age. He actually died in Tyrone, not a million miles from where Adrian and I live. How he ended up down there, I don't know. I think it was a tragic coach accident of some kind. He had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. But the eldest was a girl, so she can't inherit the estate. It has to go the male line. The next eldest boy is Hugh, and I'll come to him in a minute. And the next eldest boy is Alexander. And then the youngest child is Harriet. Alexander appears to have been born, I'll use the term deaf-mute, which is extremely old-fashioned, and forgive me for using it, but it would seem he was probably born certainly with a hearing impairment. Whether that made it difficult for him to communicate verbally, I don't know, but all the evidence is that he communicated by a notepad. So that may suggest something much stronger, that he physically couldn't talk. I don't know, but that rendered a problem. He did marry. He never had a legal heir. But he is the youngest son. So we come then to the principal heir, Hugh. Well, you couldn't invent this. He's declared a lunatic in 1814. Now, that is an awful Victorian term, but it's also a legal term. He is declared a lunatic in 1814 in the Dublin Courts of Chancery. As a result, the management of the estate is placed in the hands of commissioners for the rest of his life. He has no say in it. Okay? One other awful side to that, we believe, is that any leases on the family estates could be for no more than 7 years. Now, if any of you have ever invested in land, no one in their right mind would ever take a lease on land of a smaller term as 7 years. That would be what is termed as economically non-viable. So at a stroke, that potentially placed the entire Boyd estates into permanent economic decline. There appeared to be no way out. No male heirs again. That just left us the two girls. But the best hope was that one of the girls could marry another Boyd. So you would think, right, well, I know for a fact there were dozens of Boyds living in County Antrim in 1818 when Harriet eventually does marry. And some of them probably had some sort of a connection through Thomas of Carngogie or otherwise. But we've got two problems here. One, they wanted to be a Boyd, ideally as close to their lineage as possible. But secondly, there has to be financial security in this as well. And up pops who? Sir John Boyd, 3rd Baronet, is the husband that is chosen to marry Harriet, the youngest girl, on the 22nd of September 1818. Is that an accident? Did the Boyds of Ballycastle know about Portincross? Did they know that the French Boyds, who then later became the Boyds of Dancing Hill, did they know they were family? We believe they did. We don't believe it was an accident. They wanted as close a familial connection to save the family as possible. The clue possibly lay in a seemingly innocent incident in the 1940s. A girl called Charlotte Violet Trench was writing a book about her ancestors, the Rays of Donegal. Now the Rays married into the Boyds of Ballycastle. So she went to visit Kathleen Isabel Boyd, living in the manor house around that time. And what's fascinating is what she records. I'll have to jerk my neck here to try and read down this. So she records this in her book. It's basically a follow-on to a conversation that took place between them. The records of the Boyd family are somewhat vague. Well, isn't that the truth, James? When I first went to Ballycastle in 1930, Miss Kathleen Boyd of the Manor House lent me her family tree, but warned me that this copy had been put together after the original was lost and that there were known to be some inaccuracies. Miss Boyd was the last of her line, and her father, the Reverend Sir Francis Boyd, descended from a distant connection of the original family. Okay? He came to Ireland when the senior male line there failed. Those are Charlotte Trench's words. They're not mine. They're in her book, which was published in 1945. I would wish to have been a fly on the wall in that conversation in 1940 or 1930. But I think the evidence is there. They must have known something about the Dancing Hill Boys. They must have known something about the history. I'm happy enough of the archives that we've investigated that we have put the connection together historically back. And if, as we believe, they're connected to the Lairds of Portincross, we can take that family back to the 14th century in Scotland, therefore 700 years. They are the second oldest cadet branch of the Boyds of Kilmarnock. Earliest evidence we found for them using Portincross in their name is 1444, but they probably were living there prior to that. And that's from documents. I got digital images of those from archives in Scotland. So, in finishing up, I just wanted to place on screen a very long list of thank yous. And if anybody's not on there, please, for God's sake, get it. I wanted to point out in grateful memory all those historians who've been directly involved in looking at the Boyd histories. From George Hill down, despite the John and Jane thing that ran the two of us ragged for the best part of a year. Reverend Hugh McNeil, God bless him. Charlotte Violet Trench for that wonderful extract from 1930. Amy Isabel Young's book on the 200 years in Inishowen. Hugh Alexander Boyd, which probably many of you will have known, who was a great local historian. And of course, Danny. And then Diane D. Ressinger, who passed away in 2018. So those are the people who've been sort of, directly involved historically in the Boyd research who've passed us now. And I have a list of lots of other people up there who've helped us along the way, and a lot of organisations who've helped us along the way. But I'm happy to answer any questions, and Adrian too, that you might have at the end. Thank you for sitting through what was a very detailed and probably a very long talk. But I can tell you that is literally a fraction of what we know. There wouldn't be enough hours in the day and days in the week to reveal all the information. So part of what Adrian and I want to do now is to pass on a legacy of these discoveries, where these things are, or if we actually have them in our possession, to someone like Nick. And really, we want the people in West Kilbride in Scotland to know more about their local history and that particular family. And by the way, all the families they married with, dozens upon dozens upon dozens, and all the research that goes with that. And of course, Ballycastle. Another thing I think I'd like you to take away from this, I think there's always been a mistake to see the Boyd story as a Boyd story in isolation. I hope tonight you've learned that the McNeils, had they not existed, that Boyd story might never have happened. And I think you only had to see the way that Hugh built the memorial. I think as much the mummy as anything else was his acknowledgement, and you see the lengths that he went to preserve that inheritance was extraordinary. And you nearly think he deliberately did that just to connive people like us for the next for the next 300 years to find it. But anyway, thank you for coming tonight, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Okay.